Welcome to Food for Thought, the place to explore, celebrate, and manifest a life motivated and defined by unconditional compassion and optimal wellness. Today's episode is Pet Cemeteries and Memorial Parks, Part 1. Before we begin, my name is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. You can find me at joyfulvegan.com and on social media. You can find my books wherever books are sold. The Joy of Vegan Baking, The Vegan Table, Color Me Vegan, Vegan's Daily Companion, On Being Vegan, the 30-Day Vegan Challenge, and The Joyful Vegan. I always joke after listing that I'm vegan, if it's not clear. So you can find my books wherever books are sold. You can join me in online cooking classes, or you can purchase on-demand classes if you're interested in topics we have already taught. You can get the video and the recipes, and you can join me in trips around the world. We have many awesome trips coming up. Rwanda in 2022 is filling up, as is our Winter Wonderland trip to Whistler in British Columbia in February 2022. The Rwanda trip is at the end of 2022. We just added a cooking demo. I'm going to be teaching while you sit and sip hot cocoa. This is in the Whistler trip, and eat fondue by the fire. As for the Rwanda trip, I don't have to do any entertaining because mountain gorillas. What more can I say? Please go to joyfulvegantrips.com for information about all of these trips and to secure your spot. We obviously do only so many trips a year, and we're really excited to get back into them post-COVID, or at least post-New World COVID, whatever this world is going to look like. It's going to take time before all that shakes out. And as you know, this podcast is possible because of the support of listeners like you. There are no sponsors or ads on Food for Thought. Maybe you think that's naive to do so, but I really rely on my listeners to support this podcast, and I can keep doing it because of you. So please go to Patreon and become a patron. You can choose a level that you would like to support at, and you get perks in return. So if you go to patreon.com/Colleen Patrick-Goudreau, I'd be most grateful. Some of the perks are discounts to the virtual cooking classes and even to the on-demand classes and many more. Thank you so much in advance for listening and subscribing and supporting. Going back several years now on my last trip to London, it was a beautiful fall day, I set out to visit two of my favorite animal-related landmarks in Hyde Park. One was the Animals in War Memorial, I think you've heard me talk about, which commemorates animals who've been killed in wars and conflicts. And two was a secret Victorian pet cemetery installed in 1881 when a local family persuaded the gatekeeper to bury their beloved dog Cherry in his favorite spot in the back garden of the gatehouse. Cherry was a Maltese terrier who died of old age and belonged to the children of Mr. and Mrs. J. Lewis Barnard, who regularly visited Hyde Park, and they had befriended the gatekeeper, Mr. Winbridge. And so when Cherry died, they approached Mr. Winbridge to ask if they could lay Cherry to rest in the back garden of his lodge. He granted them permission, and the idea soon caught on. A tiny tombstone still stands bearing the inscription, "Poor Cherry died April 28th, 1881. Prince, a Yorkshire Terrier, who was the companion of the Duke of Cambridge. He was the next to be interred after meeting his untimely end under the wheel of a carriage, unfortunately. And soon after, Hyde Park became the place for wealthy Londoners to bury their beloved companions. Now, by the time the cemetery officially closed in 1903, when it ran out of space, 300 graves filled the back garden. It's not open to the public today still, but you can arrange for special one-hour viewings for up to 6 people, and you can contact the Royal Parks to do so. Alternatively, and this is how I've seen the cemetery a few times now, if you walk west along Bayswater Road, passing Victoria Lodge, which is in Hyde Park, you can look through the iron railings to catch a glimpse of the little graveyard. And you can still see these really touching inscriptions on headstones for companion dogs, cats, and even birds. You can see pictures if you just do a search online. I can certainly add them to my website, joyfulvegan.com. But if you just do a search online, you can actually see photos of these headstones that people have taken through this iron fence, because it's not something you can get into unless you have that special tour. So here are some of the inscriptions. You have a headstone that says, Daisy, dearly loved and deeply mourned. You have Darling Dolly, my sunbeam, my consolation, my joy. You have Thomas, dearly loved, faithful, and affectionate friend. Prince, he asked for so little and gave so much. I'm getting choked up reading these. I'm such a dork. You have one that says, in memory of Jim, a little dog with a big heart. And you have Bobbitt, born in 1885, dying 6 years later. And it says, in memory of our darling wee Bobbitt, for 6 years, our loving and most devoted friend who passed away on January 16th, 1901, so lonely without our darling sweetheart. Now, we don't know anything about Bobbitt's family, but we do know he had one and was clearly well cared for and well loved, as were all of the animals buried in this little cemetery. Like many Victorians, his guardians would have believed in an afterlife, not just for themselves, but for their companion animals. And in believing in that afterlife, they were also convinced they would see Bobbitt again, as evidenced by the end of the inscription on that headstone that read, when our lonely lives are over and our spirits from this earth shall roam, we hope he'll be there waiting to give us a welcome home. Now, we can't necessarily tell from just the names on the gravestones if they were dogs or cats. Not all of them. Some of them say whether they are a dog or cat, but most of them would be dogs, and some just say cat. Some just say cat. And we can guess from others. There's on one headstone it just says Budgie, and it's likely that this was a budgie, which is a small parrot. In American English, we would call that bird a parakeet. In the UK, they would be called budgies. So if the gravestone says Budgie as a name, he was probably a budgie. There has been a rumor that there was a pet monkey, which is horrible anyway. But I think, and I've read a lot to support this, that there are no historic documents that there actually was a pet monkey buried there. It's possibly a dog who was named Monkey. The story of animal burials in general, and pet burials in particular, is a fascinating one. It's a changing one, and it's a very old one. Many human cultures buried animal remains, and archaeologists have unearthed ancient pet burials dating as far back as 14,000 years from the dawn of animal domestication. And while there are some researchers who are reluctant to use the word cemetery to describe the site of a mass burial of animal bones, what's clear is that the relationships between human and non-humans is complex and ancient. Many of you have already heard about ancient Egyptians who would have sacrificed and mummified cats to accompany people to the grave. And you have this grave site, which is quite old and quite remarkable, at the ancient Egyptian Red Sea port of Berenike. I'm just going to call it Berenike. I'm sure there's many different ways to pronounce it. There's a couple different pronunciations of it. I'm calling it Berenike. But animals seem to have been treated differently there. So in general, cats would have been sacrificed and mummified. But at this seaport, animals were not mummified or placed in human tombs. Rather, they were buried in what some researchers are calling the world's oldest pet cemetery, though, again, others just hesitate to call it a cemetery unless it's a very specific site away from a town, away from city living, away from where people would have been dwelling, and just the bones of animals. So there are very specific criteria to follow if you want to call it a cemetery. So neither here nor there. In this place, there are nearly 600 animals, mostly cats, but also dogs and imported monkeys, unfortunately, who have been buried just beyond the walls of what was almost 2,000 years ago a bustling port. Now, many were laid to rest wearing metal collars or beaded collars. Their bodies were covered in textiles or ceramics. But the question, of course, the researchers have to ask is, were they pets? Now, I'm using the word pet here for convenience sake. I realize, as you know, I believe very much that our words matter and that the language we use to talk about other animals affects and reflects the way we think about them and treat them. And when we use the word pet, the one meaning of the word pet implies that they are there as our plaything. And yet, when we are talking about these cemeteries, we're not calling them animal companion cemeteries just yet. We're calling them pet cemeteries. So I'm using it as a shortcut. And that's the question that researchers are asking. Were they pets? Were they actual companions of the people in this part of Egypt who would have lived among these animals 2,000 years ago and buried them? Why were they buried? And so this, and of course, is this the oldest known site where humans buried their companion animals? So, of course, with lots of history, especially ancient history, we don't know for sure. We can't know for sure. There's some speculation that since Berenike was a port, pest control would have been very important. So the animals may have been used for pest control, right? And not kept solely as companions. But nonetheless, this burial site is unique in the reverential manner in which the animals seem to have been placed. And you can type in Berenike, Berenike, and cats. You could see the fossils and you can see their collars. The largest known series of dog burials in the ancient world. I'm trying to avoid saying cemetery because there's still speculation, but the largest known series of dog burials in the ancient world was not here in Egypt. It was actually discovered a couple decades ago at the Ashkelon National Park in Ashkelon on the Mediterranean coast in Israel, where skeletons of somewhere between 500 to 1,500 dogs were buried over the course of a century, beginning about 2,500 years ago. So about 2,500 years ago, dogs began to be buried in this spot, in this area, and and we have 500 to 1,500 dogs. I mean, it's hard because if you don't have all of the bones to put together individual animals, but this is what they're estimating. The exact count, of course, is unclear because there's just a lot of incomplete skeletons. But others also may have eroded into the sea, so it could have been more. But even the lower estimates, according to researchers, indicate an extraordinary number of burials. Archaeologists don't usually see that many in one spot. So it remains a mystery. Also, this one, there's only speculation. It's possible that there was a plague that killed the entire population of dogs in the city, and so they wanted to bury them all at once to stop the spread. It could also have been that it was a cemetery for companion animals. They don't know for sure exactly what it is. What's certain, though, is that there doesn't seem to be evidence of a ritual killing. So that is what is making them believe that it's more of a cemetery for companion animals rather than a ritual killing. So what's certain is that there was a deliberate burial of special dogs between, you ready for this? 7,000 and 8,000 years ago in Eastern Russia. So during this period, so 7 to 8,000 years ago, and we would have had foragers. People would have been foragers at this time. This is where we can find evidence that people began burying their dead in cemeteries, even though they were foragers and they were nomadic, and they would have given the same treatment to their canines. So Robert Losey is an archaeologist. He kept coming up in the research I was doing. He's an archaeologist at the University of Alberta, Canada, and he researches ancient human-dog relationships. And he hypothesizes that people saw those particular dogs as being spiritually the same as themselves. They were an animal with a soul, an animal with an afterlife. That's why I brought that up about the Victorians. So how people view the animals in life, the living animals, and what they surmise happens to them after they die affects how they treat them when they die. So he surmises that that those people in this eastern part of Russia would have believed animals had a soul. And that's really important to consider. In human cultures and in eras where the belief was or is that animals have souls, burials, cemeteries, and especially funerals and rituals are present. Now, so for instance, in the Japanese culture, especially Japanese Buddhists, they have a long tradition of burying pets because there was never a question that animals had souls. So one of Japan's many pet cemeteries, Japan has many pet cemeteries. There's one called Jindaji Pet Cemetery, and it's in the Jindaji Temple in a suburb of Tokyo. And inside the cemetery are corridors of shelves spanning from the floor to ceiling. And people adorn their shelf with photos of their animals along with small vases of artificial flowers. And there's Buddhist prayer plaques, there's urns, and there's even cans of cat and dog food for the afterlife. Outside is a more typical cemetery featuring engraved stones and plenty of flowers. So it really depends on how the cultures and the people and the religion views the animals and their afterlife that really determines whether they're going to have rituals and burials in cemeteries. And while ancient humans may have interred animals for a variety of reasons, they could have been sacrificed as part of a larger ritual or buried to get rid of rotting corpses, as we've said, we can say for certain that thousands of years ago, as well as hundreds of years ago through to today, animals were buried because they were beloved companions or members of the family worthy of a memorial, which brings us back to the Victorian era, a time when we see a marked shift from regarding animals as serving functional working roles to being regarded as family members. We see this shift. Now, for millennia, I mean, the history of how cats came into our lives as companions, I think, is incredibly interesting. It's very different than how dogs came into our lives. So cats, for many millennia, would have been used for pest control, and dogs would have been used for hunting or herding or security. But that began to change when we started seeing animals as companions and meeting our emotional needs rather than as just being utilitarian. And so it follows that the way animals are treated and perceived when they're alive is reflected in the way they're treated when they die. And so around 1881, we have what became one of the first public pet cemeteries in England in Hyde Park. Like I said, it's not open to the public now, but it would have been at the time. Now we have, that's 1881, remember. In 1899, in Paris, we have an elaborate, beautiful, sculpted pet cemetery, believed to be the first public zoological necropolis in the world. And a necropolis, I did have to look it up as well. I'm like, wait, what's the difference between a necropolis and a cemetery? So a necropolis is basically a large cemetery, but one that's more like a memorial park with large elaborate temples and ornate tombs, right? So in other words, a necropolis is just a large cemetery. A necropolis is a cemetery, but a cemetery isn't necessarily a necropolis. So if you think about the fact that necropolis means city of the dead. When I think of the first time I visited Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, it's an incredible necropolis. When it opened in 1804, that's exactly what I thought of, because there's all these elaborate tombs and monuments and mausoleums along winding roads, and it looks exactly like a city for the dead. So that's what I think of when I think of a necropolis. And you have that in Paris, not just at Père Lachaise for humans, but you have it in the Cemetery of the Dogs. I'm not going to try and pronounce it in French. Opened in 1899. It is the oldest pet cemetery in Europe, and it is certainly one of the world's oldest intentional pet cemeteries. It's located in a Paris suburb. And it's a beautiful Art Nouveau cemetery. It has beautiful arches on the front gate. You can see photos online, stone animal sculptures above some pets' tombstones, and some famous dogs to boot. Rin Tin Tin is probably the most famous. We'll talk about other famous animals in a bit, but there are 40,000 animals buried here, and many living cats, apparently. There are a lot of cats who wander around the cemetery, but they are fed. They have access to food and water. Now, moving on to the United States, we not only have some Victorian era pet cemeteries, we also have one of the oldest animal burial sites. Are you ready for this? In southern Illinois are the ancient remains of 3 dogs who were buried, you ready? About 10,000 years ago. They are the oldest dog fossils found in the Americas so far. So far. Researchers assert that the dogs were clearly buried intentionally. And like I said earlier, the lack of damage to their bones indicates that they died of natural causes rather than as a result of human butchery or ritual killing. And then their analysis of their teeth and bones suggests that the dogs ate fish, which means they were either fed by humans or allowed to scavenge near human settlements. And one of the things that is remarkable is that whereas it was thought that they were 8,500 years old, which is still old, new evidence suggests that they were actually 10,000 years old, but that they were likely grieved when they died because they, in fact, had been given their own graves in the plot. So that's 10,000 years ago, an intentional dog burial. But as far as America's largest and oldest pet cemetery, you can find that in Hartsdale, New York. So I don't know if you're following this, but this is 1896 when you have America's largest and oldest pet cemetery. 1896. Remember, Paris was 1899. And you've got Hyde Park in 1881. So we're going pretty far back here. And this one in the United States goes back even farther than the one before the Paris one was built. So you've got this one in 1896 in Hartsdale, New York. A veterinarian working out of Manhattan offered to let a neighbor, who was grieving the loss of her dog, he let her bury her dog on his hillside. He had an apple orchard. And so that was in 1896. Today, this 5-acre property, which is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which means it will be there for good, is the final resting place for more than 80,000 animals. I found some accounts of 100,000 animals. I saw some that said 70,000 animals. I'm just going to go with 80 because I saw that as well a couple times. So 80,000 animals. You've got dogs, you've got cats, you've got rabbits, you've got birds, reptiles, monkeys, and horses. Oh, and there's a lion, and there are even some humans. I think there are 50 humans. There are also tributes to the dog Leica, who was sent into space in the 1950s. We will talk about her. She's not buried in the cemetery, but there is a monument to her. This pet cemetery is in full operation, meaning they are still taking in new interments. So if you'd like to have your beloved animal buried there, you can do so, Hartsdale, New York. The second oldest in the United States is called Aspen Hill. I just have to make a note of the spelling. It was named after, I think, some dog kennels in the UK, which was spelled Aspin as opposed to Aspen, Aspen, like the tree. So it's Aspen, if you look it up, Aspen, Aspin Hill, Aspen Hill Pet Cemetery. And that is in Silver Spring, Maryland. I'm not going to name all of the U.S. pet cemeteries. I just wanted to name another old one. It's the second oldest in the United States in Silver Spring, Maryland. Among the 50,000 animals buried here, there are dogs, there are cats, there are horses, there are goats, there are hamsters. There are also monkeys, frogs, and fish. Now, this cemetery began in 1920. Richard and Bertha Burney were dog breeders, hence they're naming it after a dog kennel in the UK. They bought 8 acres of land to build a kennel to breed dogs in the early 1900s. And then initially it was supposed to be a place just for their dogs and close friends. But as the kennel grew and their social circle grew, others wanted a place to bury their animals as well. So you've still got 8 acres on this property, and there are 50 humans, as I said. Now, most human cemeteries do not allow humans, although there are some exceptions, and I will talk about a couple of those. I'm going to talk about a couple. There are probably more exceptions than those I'm going to talk about. But it's not uncommon that you would have humans buried in a pet cemetery, but it's less like, you just don't see that very often. You also just don't have pet cemeteries as much as you have human cemeteries. So it was quite significant in 2016. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, he made it legal to bury pets next to their people in human cemeteries. So that's pretty significant, and we might see more and more of that happening. The history of and the trajectory of pet cemeteries and animal burials is so interesting because it says so much about our relationships with other animals and our perception of them. So I think this is a step toward why not. I remember, and I will talk about this briefly, when I was at the cemetery where we're going to be buried and where my mother is buried, I remember asking the gentleman we were working with if our animals could be buried there. And he said no. And he said, I know it's silly because most people want to be buried with their animals. He said, there's this notion that people would feel it's disrespectful if animals are buried where their loved ones are, where their people are. And I disagree, and he disagreed as well. But for now, it's an exception rather than a rule that human cemeteries allow animals to be buried there as well. But I think that could change. I really do. I really do. So that property, it's very interesting. This Aspen Hill Cemetery, Pet Cemetery, has passed through several owners before being given to the Montgomery County Humane Society in 2007. And while I'm pretty sure you can visit, I don't believe it takes in new interments. I think it's more of a memorial park at this point. But the property is listed on Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties, meaning, again, it will remain a cemetery for animals. One of the owners of the property at one point was PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, until 1996. And they have left their mark, which I love. When they were running the cemetery, when PETA was running the cemetery, they created a shrine of sorts to animals who lost their hides for fur coats or who were killed in laboratory experiments. So you have a grave site that actually holds about a half dozen fur coats. This is according to the cemetery's gravedigger. His name is James Thompson. He's been the gravedigger there since 1968. And elsewhere, you have a 6-inch high granite mouse, which marks the grave dedicated to millions of lab rats over a bronze marker that reads, "To Emily, Annie, Jane, and Rue, and the millions of rats used in medical experimentation and product testing." I love that so much. I love that so much. Oh, gosh, I just want to put this out there to you who's listening. Wouldn't it be lovely if we had more and more monuments in cities, not just pet cemeteries, but actually in cities and parks, monuments that marked the animals who have suffered at the hands of humans? I mean, how beautiful would that be? I think I just got an idea for another podcast episode because I know there are cities that do mark monuments, not just graves, but monuments to animals. Okay, I think I'm going to have to do that. But still, I'm going to put this out to you because you can work with your city. You can raise money. We can have statues built and monuments built to the animals who we love so much, some of whom have suffered so much at our hands. But that's going to be another topic. Now, in case you didn't know this, the case of the Silver Spring monkey. So Silver Spring, Maryland is where the cemetery is. This is why PETA had owned it at one point. They had operations there. But the case of the Silver Spring monkeys essentially launched the founding of PETA in 1981. And so just a brief summary, if you don't know this, this is directly from PETA's website. It was just easier to just lift it from their website. All credit due to them. At the Institute for Behavioral Research, monkeys were subjected to debilitating surgeries in which their spinal nerves were severed. PETA initiated a groundbreaking investigation that led to the nation's first arrest and criminal conviction of an animal experimenter for cruelty to animals, the first confiscation of abused animals from a laboratory, and the first U.S. Supreme Court victory for animals used in experiments. It even led to landmark additions to the Animal Welfare Act and unrelenting public scrutiny of the abuse that animals endure in experimentation. Because of that investigation, IBR, the Institute for Behavioral Research, closed its doors. And that's why you have laboratory animals honored at the Aspen Hill Cemetery in Silver Spring, Maryland, because PETA had owned it at the time and wanted to honor those animals. So the seed has been planted. I'm really excited to look at more memorials to animals around the world. Okay. Now, that's a good segue to the fact that many pet cemeteries are also resting places for famous, infamous, and heroic animals, especially dogs, cats, and horses. There's a quirky little cemetery in Linwood, New Jersey. It's also one of the oldest pet cemeteries in the U.S. It's called Clara Glen Pet Cemetery. It was started in 1918, so even older than Aspen Hill. It was started in 1918 by a husband and wife who had numerous animals. I'm not sure what to make of the 45 dogs and dozens of cats and over 300 rabbits. So aside from that, they could find no pet cemetery to meet their needs for all of their animals, and so they started one of their own in their own backyard. Soon, friends and family were also burying their pets there, and the Clara Glen Pet Cemetery was born. According to Atlas Obscura, by the way, if you don't know Atlas Obscura, may I please put a plug in for them? They have a wonderful website, just lots of quirky, interesting, unique places around the world. They're just incredible. I really love them, and you can join their mailing list and just get lots of really great stories every day. Atlas Obscura is the name. So according to Atlas Obscura, quote, the couple offered other services as well. They built coffins for the deceased animals. They took pictures of the dead animals, some of which were put atop their own gravestones. A collection of these photos is now in the possession of the Linwood Historical Society. Interesting. Sounds like an interesting couple, interesting place. So many celebrities who performed in nearby Atlantic City buried their companions in Clara Glen, including Irving Berlin and Eddie Cantor, just two of the celebrities who buried their animals at the cemetery. And apparently the dog, Petey, from Our Gang. If you don't know who Petey is, you've never seen Our Gang and The Little Rascals. I grew up watching this. It was before my time, but I was watching reruns. And Petey is a very, very famous dog with his little round, black eye patch. Well, not patch, but a little spot around his eye. He's very cute. His name was Petey, and apparently he's buried there. So that's very interesting. Now, I mentioned that Rin Tin Tin was buried in the cemetery for dogs in Paris. If you're too young to know who he was a world famous German Shepherd who appeared in nearly 30 Hollywood films and is largely responsible for the popularity of the breed as pets, German Shepherds. Rin Tin Tin's descendants starred in even more films and the Adventures of Rin Tin Tin television series. And despite being an American movie star, interestingly, Rin Tin Tin is actually buried in France because that's where he was found and rescued from the trenches during World War I. What? That's insane. So stay tuned to hear more about animal war memorials and cemeteries, because I'm going to talk about that. But Rin Tin Tin, American movie star and TV star, but actually buried in France because he was found and rescued from the trenches. I also want to just say at this point, if you are curious about my thoughts about animals in film, because obviously I'm making reference to that without saying anything else, I do have a 3-part series, I think, called Animals in Film, and I really go deep into my thoughts about and the history of animals in film and any regulations that actually do or do not protect them from cruelty. So if you are interested in my thoughts about animals in film, on the Food for Thought podcast, you can find a series called Animals in Film. So I encourage you to go and check that out. Now, it's no surprise that in Los Angeles we have many animals who were loved by the rich and famous, even if they themselves weren't rich and famous, the animals. But there's the Los Angeles Pet Cemetery, which was formerly called Los Angeles. I actually have notes that say the Los Angeles Pet Cemetery was formerly called the Los Angeles Pet Cemetery. Okay, I didn't get that. I forgot what it was. But the Los Angeles Pet Cemetery, you can visit animals who belonged to, for lack of a better, who were companions of Charlie Chaplin. So we have Charlie Chaplin's cat. We have Rudolph Valentino's Doberman. We have Steven Spielberg's Jack Russell Terrier. We have Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall's Champagne Cocker Spaniel Droopy. And we have Jimmy Durante's Irish Setter Muggins. So you can go to the Los Angeles Pet Cemetery, and there's also another pet cemetery in the Los Angeles area. I believe I make reference to it. If I haven't, you can just search for it, because one of them is actually still open for new business. So you can bring your animal there if you want to bury your animal there. Now, speaking of famous people and their animals, I don't know if you've heard of this person. I hadn't heard of this person, but this person was one of the most famous people of his time. And it's a good segue into his famous people, but also kind of this middle gray area of burying animals and they're humans in the same cemetery. So there was a man named Sigmund Neuberger. He was born in Berlin, Germany in 1871. He was one of the highest paid entertainers of his generation. He was an illusionist, he was a magician, and he was very good friends with Harry Houdini. His name was the Great Lafayette. He actually changed his name legally, so his tombstone says the Great Lafayette. It doesn't say Sigmund Neuberger. So his name was the Great Lafayette. And Harry Houdini, was a very good friend of Neuberger, and he gifted him with a dog who the Great Lafayette named Beauty. And he was a little terrier, and Lafayette loved this dog. There's actually, I think Lafayette had more difficulties with humans. I think he probably liked animals more, actually, I shouldn't say that. He probably loved his dog more than I think he loved humans, because I'm saying it broadly about animals, although he had compartmentalized compassion like so many of us have or do, right? Because he was an illusionist. He used animals in his shows and lions. He actually, we'll get to it. Hold that thought. Put a pin in that. So the reason I say this about his affection for dogs, or his dog, over people in general, is because apparently there was a plaque over the entrance to his London home that said, "The more I see of men, the more I love my dog." And I know some of you feel that way too, but let's not be cynical. So apparently this dog Beauty was a very spoiled dog. Very spoiled. He loved her to bits and pieces. And Beauty died in 1911. And apparently Lafayette was just overcome with grief. And he had his little dog laid out on a silk pillow, surrounded by lilies. He was in Scotland touring. And so he had the little dog in the Caledonian Hotel. He then had Beauty embalmed and was given permission. He went to the city of Edinburgh, where he was performing, and he insisted that his dog be buried in Edinburgh at Piers Hill Cemetery. And the city agreed, provided that he be buried in the same place. So in this case, the city was, people did not bury animals in these human cemeteries, but he was rich and famous, of course, had more sway than you and I would. And the city said, well, if you're going to be buried there as well, then okay, that's fine. Unexpectedly, Lafayette died 4 days after his dog died in a fire at the theater he was performing. And I was saying the pin that I put in that before was that he was performing a trick using a lion. And of course, the lion was in a cage and died in the same fire that killed Lafayette, and 11 members of the theater staff died as well. There is a story. A lot of this might be apocryphal. And this is what I mean when I say, kind of compartmentalized compassion, conditional compassion, where he obviously loved his dog very much, had no problem using animals in his performances. However, the story goes that he actually escaped the fire in the theater and actually went back to rescue his horse and did not succeed in doing so. And in attempting to, that's when he died. He was killed in the theater in this fire. And so he's buried in Piers Hill Cemetery in Edinburgh, just inside the Portobello Road entrance. And you can see his grave. It's a huge stone with memorial stones to both himself, the Great Lafayette, and to his dog, Beauty. Now, Beauty is not the only animal buried there at Piers Hill Cemetery in Edinburgh. There's also a pet cemetery. And there are many animals with grand gravestones. You can see these monuments if you do a search for Piers Hill. It's Piershill. There's a cat named Buzz, and it says, "All roads lead to Bobastis." Now, Bobastis was the center of worship for the feline goddess Bast. So Bobastis was the center of worship. So it says, "Buzz, all roads lead to Bobastis." And then you have possibly a cat. It just says Satan, so gentle, you'll live in our hearts forever. His name was Satan. So you have a pet cemetery in Piers Hill Cemetery in Edinburgh. Okay, since I've already decided that I am going to do a podcast episode on memorials to animals, I'm really excited about that. I'm going to just mention the Animals in War Memorial in London, which, as I said, commemorates animals who've been killed in wars and conflicts. And it's absolutely worth a visit if you haven't been there. So I'm going to come back to that when we talk about memorials and monuments to animals in another episode. But that's a memorial, not a cemetery. And so keeping to our theme, we do have in London another cemetery called Ilford Animal Cemetery. It's also called People's Dispensary for Sick Animals at PDSA, and it's home to more than 3,000 deceased animals. This cemetery, Ilford Animal Cemetery, also houses the remains of about a dozen animals, from carrier pigeons to search and rescue dogs, who received the PDSA Dickin Medal for their actions during World War II. It's like the animal version of the Victoria Cross, and this medal recognizes animals that displayed astounding bravery during battle. Now, when we talk about war memorials, we will certainly talk about the fact that animals did not, vote to serve, but nonetheless, the fact that they are, posthumously and much later after the fact honored in a cemetery like that, and with this medal, I'm quite moved by that. We have another cemetery these are all war cemeteries I'm talking about here, and we'll talk about war memorials another time. But there is a war dog cemetery in Guam, at a U.S. naval base in Guam's Apra Harbor, and it's called the National War Dog Cemetery. It honors 25 military dogs who died in the 1944 Second Battle of Guam, and in the battle, the dogs apparently helped members of the U.S. Marine Corps by serving as guards and carrying medical supplies and finding bombs in enemy combatants. And so this cemetery and these 25 dogs were dedicated 50 years to the day after Americans recaptured Guam from Japanese control. And the cemetery features dozens of graves and a granite sculpture of Kurt, who was a Doberman pinscher who alerted troops of an imminent attack and saved the lives of around 250 Marines. So, again, I don't support animals being used in combat, but it has to be said that's quite moving and quite lovely. We want more evidence of our reverence for and appreciation for and our love of other animals. Now, other pet cemeteries that have a specific spot for war animals include some of the ones we've already talked about, such as Heartsdale Cemetery in New York. And there's a really special memorial there I'm going to talk about in my memorial episode, so I'm going to come back to that. But allow me some crossover here, because there are some situations where there are memorials and cemeteries and and burials. But what we have in the Heartsdale Cemetery is there is a monument. There's a monument to dogs who served in World War I, and this was unveiled in 1923. So I'm going to talk about that another time. But there is a part of the cemetery that is home to several dogs who served in wars. So not just a memorial, but actually animals who are buried there who served in. There was a Scamp, who was a World War II canine soldier. There's another one who served in Vietnam. And because Heartsdale also honors any animals who've been service animals at all, there is actually a ceremony every year to honor service dogs. There are police dog burials here at the cemetery, and there are also cenotaphs paying tribute to dogs who helped search for survivors in bombings and terrorist attacks. You have dogs buried here who helped with the search and rescue following the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, if you remember that. I do very well. And there's also Sirius, a dog, Sirius, Sirius, a dog who lost his life in the September 11th terror attacks. He's also here. And then finally, for our war-related cemeteries, we have a very small, very obscure little cemetery called the Presidio Pet Cemetery. I have been to this cemetery, and it's really amazing. We actually happened upon it upon it several years ago. I didn't know it was there until we happened upon it. And so when I was writing this episode, I wanted to include it. And so these are animals, the Presidio Pet Cemetery. They didn't serve in combat, but they're worth mentioning here because these were companion animals who served the military families who lived at the Presidio when the Presidio was an army post. So before their deaths, you have, these animals who were loved by their people. And so Skipper was one of them. And the headstone reads, "The best damn dog we ever had." You have many that just read just these beautiful sentiments to their animals. And you have a sign that says, "The love these animals gave will never be forgotten." So it's a very tiny half-acre plot. It's not, you could miss it if you blink, but there are over 400 animals here. And there are birds, there are rodents, there are reptiles interred here. There are fish. There's one there, we don't know. There's Mr. Iguana. We assume he's an iguana. And so this is, it's quite remarkable that it's still there. There was someone who kind of took this up as her pet project, no pun intended. And she has really allowed the cemetery to remain. And it's actually not a contributing resource to the Presidio's National Historic Landmark District status, but the trust is actually committed to preserving this special site. So thanks to, there was a preservation specialist who made sure to document the condition of every grave marker. She's created a conservation plan for it. So if you come to San Francisco, you walk around the Presidio, make sure you look at a map and identify where this little cemetery is, because it's a pretty sweet little surprise. So those are just some of the cemeteries I wanted to talk about. Of course, you can search for a pet cemetery near you. There are pet cemeteries all around the world. There are several in Berlin, Germany. There are pet cemeteries I named already Japan, and all around the world. And it's quite moving because while our relationships with other animals has evolved over the millennia, when it comes to those with whom we spend our time and with whom we share our homes, even that has changed, right? There was a time when dogs and cats were seen merely as utilitarian. Then they became companions, and then they became our family members. And one of the ways we know about this evolution is by how people buried their animals and what they say on their headstones when they bury them. And I was inspired to record this podcast after hearing another podcast. There's another podcast I listen to. It's not another. I don't listen to my podcast. There's a podcast I listen to called History Extra Podcast, and I listen to episodes several times a week, almost every day. They have almost daily podcasts, quite amazing, and wonderful interviews. And one day I heard an interview with a Dr. Eric Tourigny. I don't remember how to say his name. Tourigny. That's how I would think to say it. Tourigny. Tourigny. And he's an historical archaeologist who was excavating a 19th century house in Toronto, Canada, a few years ago now, when he learned that the owners had buried their dog in the backyard. And he began to think, what if we looked at pet cemeteries as a way to reconstruct the past human-animal relationships? And I love that. And so I really loved the interview. And it was based, the interview, a lot of interviews, and I can speak from experience, come from, you having written a book. And so you do the tour and you have interviews and you go on podcasts and you go on radio and TV and you talk about your book. He doesn't have a book, and I want him to write a book because I'm really fascinated by his work, but he has written some scholarly articles, and they've actually been quite picked up and written about themselves. Like those articles that he has submitted to scholarly journals have been used for other articles. And so there's one in the Smithsonian. And so here's a quote from the Smithsonian. Tourigny decided to visit 4 large pet cemeteries in the United Kingdom. Now you know some of these, including the one in Hyde Park, starting back with Cherry in 1881 in Hyde Park. And he collected data from 1,169 different grave markers from 1881 to 1991. And so what he found was, in the 19th century, it was common for people to dispose of their pets, their dead pets, in the river. They would throw them in the river. They would throw them in the trash. Sometimes they sold them for skin or meat. But what started to happen, he starts to see this shift like we see in the Hyde Park Cemetery. Now, this was a case where, of course, the wealthier people, the wealthy, could afford to bury their pets. But of course, the poor couldn't even afford their own gravestone. So they don't have the money for, burial of their animals, right? It's not that the poor didn't care about their animals. It's not even that the people before Victorian times didn't care about their animals. It was a different way of handling dead animals, either by, like I said, throwing them in the river, throwing them in the trash. But sometimes those who lacked money would actually be able to sell their animal carcass to make money, either to the knacker yard, like so they'd, be sold to a slaughterhouse for, ground up fodder, or like I said, for their pelts. So what he starts to see change is that you start to see how their bodies were dealt with differently after their death. So this is a course that starts to happen over time, and so deciding to bury them was a turning point in our evolving relationship with animals that reflects the values and norms of different historical eras. So that's what I love about his work, because you can see it literally in the inscriptions. And so during England's Victorian period, and he's British, and so he actually, I'm not sure if he's British. I don't think he's British. For some reason, I think he's Canadian. But he focused on England, and England's Victorian period spanned from 1837 to 1901. And so you have mourning as a very highly structured practice with proper rules and proper etiquette, right? So grief eventually becomes more of a public practice in the Victorian era, even towards animals. And so that's why you see some of the epitaphs on these headstones that referenced values like obedience and fidelity, which themselves were core Victorian ideals. So you see these very lovely little sentiments, darling, fluffy, wee butcha, like very sweet, very simple. But then over time, as in the late 18th century, the early 19th century, Britain becomes a nation of, for lack of a better, pet keepers, right? They started investing time and money and feelings into their animals, into their companion animals. The well-being of their animals starts to become considered. There's the founding of the RSPCA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. There's the founding of animal shelters, and we see laws dedicated to the protection of animals. It's also when dog breeding, that's the reality. It's when dog breeding, the creation of pet breed standards, was developed. Now, of course, at this time, science is progressing, and which means you also have a lot of animal research and vivisection, right? Thus, you have the birth of the anti-vivisection movement. So in short, humans start shifting our feelings about other animals and their role in our lives and in our thoughts. And this continues as we move into the 20th century, and a shift that Tourigny identifies after World War II, when guardians, I'm saying guardians, they wouldn't have called themselves guardians, they would have called themselves owners, began to refer to themselves, though. Maybe they would have called themselves guardians if they had that word. That is a word that we use now, or I think has been encouraged to be used by certain animal organizations who kind of took up that mantle. But they actually start beginning to refer to themselves as mummy and dad on the epitaphs of the headstones. So you're starting to see the shift in the way people see the animals as part of their family, not just as companions. And then you see a rise, this is all Tourigny's work, a rise in how many gravestones had the family's surname written on them. And then you also see in the 20th century, cat graves become increasingly more common, whereas before it was mostly dog graves. So you see this shift in our relationship with other animals, and you see it through pet cemeteries. And I think that's really fascinating. Something else that begins to change, going back to what we said early on about the afterlife and the perception of animals and their souls and religion, is in the 19th century, tombstones rarely featured religious symbols. And this is the mid-19th century. Like, you wouldn't see Christian crosses, you wouldn't see Jewish stars of David, you wouldn't see those on a gravestone, and they avoided any mention that animals would be reunited with their owners, in their guardians, in the afterlife. And at the time, the United Kingdom was very highly religious at the time, and Christianity traditionally would have said that animals do not continue after, they don't have an afterlife, right? So just saying that your animal is going to go to heaven would have been very controversial, but that shifts and that changes, and you can see it even in our example of Bobbitt, one of the first dogs I mentioned, who was buried in that Victorian cemetery. in 1881, where you see they talk about seeing him again in the afterlife. So you see this shift, right? Now, animals are valued more than ever, companion animals especially. Yes, I realize there is compartmentalized compassion when it comes to other animals. But one of the things I talk about in The Joyful Vegan, by the way, is we are able to compartmentalize even how we feel about companion animals. Because if you think about people's perception of and defense of animals in research laboratories, you will often hear people say, like, I know they're dogs and they're cats, but if it's going to help humans, then I'm okay with it. So we even compartmentalize dogs and cats, right? So we it's very easy and a little cynical to just say, like, oh, people don't care about other animals. They only care about dogs and cats. Well, we're still testing on dogs and cats. So we're able to compartmentalize even animals within their own species. So just a little interesting thought there, but you could find more in The Joyful Vegan if you're interested in reading my book on that. So the point is, we do seem to, though, today value, if you look at the amount of money we spend on companion animals, we do value them. And frankly, things are shifting even more. I mentioned that, Cuomo is allowing animals to be buried with their people in human cemeteries. In 2014, Catholics were, well, at least the animal lovers, were quite taken aback and happy when Pope Francis hinted that their animal companions would join them in heaven. So things will continue to shift. They are continuing to shift. Now, look, pet cemeteries, they do represent a very small proportion of animals who die. I think 1% of companion animals are buried in pet cemeteries. Most are buried in back gardens, backyards. Today, a lot of us cremate our pets, our animals, and may keep their ashes. That's what we've done with our beloved animals. With the kitties, we've had the joy and honor of loving in our lives, well, in their lives, until they died. My childhood dog, she died in my early 20s, and my father did bury her in the backyard of the house he was living in at the time in Livingston, New Jersey. So she's still there. But all of my cats, my kitties, Simon and Schuster and Cassandra, they have all been cremated, and I have their ashes, and I have been thinking of burying them. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet, but this episode has been really fun for me too, because I've been looking at, what other options do I want to explore? I have I have their footprints. A lot of us do that these days before they die. The place they go, the vet or wherever they wind up going to get cremated, the crematorium, they will often make an imprint of their little paws. So we do have the paw imprints of Simon and Schuster and Cassandra. And yeah, we have a little box and it has their name inscribed on the top. But I've been thinking about doing something else. Prior to my mother dying in 2020, I had been talking to David about what we were going to do for ourselves and for my mother post-mortem. And I had started looking at options. My mother was definitely not doing well. And so I was thinking of her imminent death. And, but I was thinking of ourselves as well. And so when she died, it was very interesting because it became very important to me to have a place where her ashes would be buried. And that's when we started to talk about the possibility of her being interred at Mountain View Cemetery here in Oakland. It's a beautiful cemetery. I would think it's safe to call it a necropolis. It's just absolutely gorgeous, beautiful monuments, and it is a park. And I've talked about it in other podcast episodes. When I was talking about Jack London, I think I was talking about it. And that is indeed where my mother's ashes are now buried and where David and I will be when we die. And so having a place to be memorialized and go and visit and be seen, like having a place for my mother to be seen, like people for them to see her, became really important. And to read the tombstone, I will confess that one of my sources of guilt, and it's just this weight hanging over me. It's just so interesting how I don't procrastinate on anything, but I have been having the hardest time choosing a headstone. It's not even a headstone, it's a pillow stone, because we don't have a full plot. We have just a half plot, which is for four urns for ashes that have been my mother and me and David. And as I said, we can't bring Charlie and Michiko with us or any of our animals because the cemetery won't allow it. But if I don't know, there's room for a fourth urn. The point is that's where we'll be. And it's a pillow stone. It's enough that we'd have a lot of room to write something in. And I have been oh my God, putting it off. And I think it's just because I feel like this is so permanent. Like, what do I want to say about me and David? And what do I want to say about my mother? There's like so much pressure I'm putting on myself. It's ridiculous. But here I am talking about these tombstones from, 40 years ago. And, and it means something and they say something and what they say has meaning. And like, it's just very interesting. So you could see why I'm putting so much pressure on myself. But the point is, I will talk about this process in another podcast episode. I've been talking a lot about just kind of life issues and I have been meaning to talk about this. Maybe when I finish doing that pillow stone, I'll do that episode. But I'm still exploring options for Charlie and Mishko. I haven't decided anything yet, but when I was writing this episode, I was very clear. I mean, David and I visit cemeteries in almost every city we go to. I love cemeteries, and the idea of being able to visit pet cemeteries, I think, is incredibly meaningful. So I look forward to visiting more as we continue with our travels. I have been to many private graves, as I mentioned in the Memorials to Animals episode I did several years ago now. I think it's a beautiful episode because it's just filled with poetry by well-known poets who wrote poems to their animals when they died. And so it's called the Memorials to Animals, I think is the episode. So if you're interested in that, you can go listen to me read some poetry, some poems by famous poets. And I talked about some of the graves that I've actually seen of, writers we knew and loved. I will say that one of the most meaningful graves I've been to, animal graves I've been to, were those in Rwanda. So you would have probably heard me talk about it. I think I talked about it in the Rwanda episode where we hiked up to Karasoki. Karasoki, it was the basically where Diane Fossey had her that's where she lived, and in Rwanda, and it's between two mountains, and it was the most treacherous hike and the longest hike and the most uphill slog I have ever been on. And all of us who did it would agree, but it was so worth that 6.5 hours it took to get up there, because to be where she was, to be where she lived, and to be where she's buried along with her gorillas, many of, now any gorillas who are part of the Diane Fossey Gorilla Fund are still buried, but they're not buried up in Karasoki. So the animals, especially Digit, who is her favorite gorilla, Silverback, he was killed by poachers, and she had requested that she be buried next to Digit, and she is. And so going to this little grave, this little tiny cemetery up there on Karasoki, and seeing the graves of several mountain gorillas some of whom had been killed by poachers, some of whom died of old age, and that's where she's buried as well, is quite magical and quite moving. And I will treasure that memory forever. I actually didn't even take photos of it because I just wanted to be there in that space and just hold that memory and hold that feeling and honor that space. And that's what cemeteries are for, memorializing those who have lived before us, honoring that relationship we have with them, seeing them, remembering them, visiting them. And that includes, of course, our animal companions. So in that episode, Memorials for Animals, I had read a poem that I'm going to end this podcast with by Robinson Jeffers. He was an American poet who lived from 1887 to 1962. And we have been to his home, which I highly recommend. I think it's called I was thinking of, I forgot what it's called. Anyway, it's in Carmel, California, so it's not far from where we are. And he's buried there, along with many of the dogs that he and his wife had and loved. And Robinson Jeffers, I wish he were more known today. I think he was quite incredible. And he is embraced by environmentalists because he wrote a lot about the natural world, its beauty, its wildness. He was an advocate for what was called inhumanism, which I kind of really love. I mean, I'm very interested in humanism as well, but I'm very interested in this idea. It's quite gone out of favor, but it's the belief that humans are too self-centered. So I encourage you to look more into it if you're interested. It was a movement that arose in the first half of the 20th century. And it took the viewpoint that humans, though they may strive to, will never be able to uncenter themselves, and called for a shifting of emphasis and significance from man to not man. And I love that. It sounds like it's misanthropic. It's not at all. It's just taking ourselves out of the center and the human chauvinism out of the center, right? And I love that. He wrote, "An infant feels himself to be central and of primary importance. An adult knows better. It's time that the human race attained to an adult habit of thought in this regard." So I love that. So he is buried by one of his favorite dogs. He and his wife had English bulldogs, and so one of them was named Haig. And he's buried there in the beautiful English garden outside the house, as is his wife. And he had written a poem when Haig died, and he wrote about his grave. So I'd like to end the episode reading The House Dog's Grave by Robinson Jeffers. "I've changed my ways a little. I cannot now run with you in the evenings along the shore, except in a kind of dream. And you, if you dream a moment, you see me there. So leave a while the paw marks on the front door where I used to scratch to go out or in, and you'd soon open. Leave on the kitchen floor the marks of my drinking pan. I cannot lie by your fire as I used to do on the warm stone, nor at the foot of your bed. Nope. All the nights through, I lie alone. But your kind thought has laid me less than 6 feet outside your window where firelight so often plays, and where you sit to read, and I fear often grieving for me. Every night your lamplight lies on my place. You, man and woman, live so long. It's hard to think of you ever dying. A little dog would get tired living so long. I hope that when you are lying under the ground like me, your lives will appear as good and joyful as mine. No, dears, that's too much to hope. You are not so well cared for as I have been, and never known the passionate, undivided fidelities that I knew. Your minds are perhaps too active, too many-sided, but to me you were true. You were never masters, but friends. I was your friend. I loved you well, and was loved. Deep love endures to the end and far past the end. If this is my end, I am not lonely. I am not afraid. I am still yours." Robinson Jeffers died in 1962. He and his wife, Una, they are buried under the yew tree on the property next to Haig. For the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Thanks for listening.